Let's talk about the source section now for a ManyChat app. The source block defines data sources that can be used when your client is configuring an action. So maybe you're configuring an opportunity sales stage and the values come from an API backend, or you're configuring an address block where you need a dropdown which has the state values for all the states in the United States. Those would be configured as sources in the source block. The first thing just starts with a simple name and a type. And there are two types of sources. There's a static type where you define what the values for the dropdown values. And then there is the dynamic type where you basically hit an API and that sends back a JSON, and then you define a JSON path to the key and value within that response, which would show up on the UI. So let's start with configuring a static one first. Let's just call this states. And over here, I'm going to select static. When you select static, it gives you a section where you can go and add static values. So I can click on plus, and we're going to have the name, which is basically your key. And so let's say I'm going to have California over here. And the value that you want going back in your JSON is CA. Let's add another one. And in this case, I am going to have Washington, and the state value would be WA. So what works with this is you have the name, which is basically your key, and the value. So if you were to see a dropdown, you would actually see the value California showing up in the dropdown. When you selected that and it had to send that value back to a backend, the value CA would get sent. Now, let's say you wanted to reorder these on how they show up in your dropdown. You could just drag this and put that up, and then it would show up in a different order. And let's just verify that. I can click on save, and the list over here says Washington first and California second. I'm just going to go back and do that again and click on save, and the ordering over here changes. So this was static state. Let's add another one, and this is going to be a dynamic one. And let's say this is opportunity status. Let's say that this is actually coming back from an API. So you would choose RPC value over here, and this would then show you parameters that you can configure for an HTTP request. So I'm going to do get over here, and my URL is going to be https myapi.example.com/opportunity. I'm not going to send any payload over here. It's just a GET request. If I had any request headers that I wanted to configure, for example, let's say I am going to pass a special X token value header with some random value over here, I could configure a request header over here. And then the main thing to be configured over here is the request mapping. Now you've configured an API endpoint, you hit this API and it brings back a JSON. You want to configure a mapping within the response of that JSON. All of this is defined in JSON path syntax. If your JSON comes back where the root is data and everything else that you require is inside a JSON property called data, you would start with .data. And then let's say the property value over there is opti state, and let's say the same thing, the value is also coming from that tag. So you will configure it like this. So what this would do is that in your JSON response, it would look for a property called data. And within that, it would look for opti. It could be an array, and it would look for all properties called opti-state, and it would get the value for that property as your key. And in this case, I've configured the same thing as my value because I want the same value. You may have another thing called value, which is the actual value that you want to say, and you could configure it that way, and that would pick it up from there. I'm going to click on save, and you'll see that you have the two sources configured over here. The first one is your static, which just has the two state values, and the second one is your dynamic one, which is actually hitting an API and getting the data back from there.